everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by the High Bar Research Alliance, also known as HRA. I'm Michael Rios from the University of California, Davis, and I'll be the moderator of today's one-hour event. This is the 20th in HRA's webinars for researchers, researcher administrators, and others who are interested in what is known as highly interactive basic and responsive research, or HIBAR. Previous webinars are available for viewing on the HRA website, which can be found at hibar-research.org. Before our featured presentation by Drs. Emily Ozer and Jennifer Rennick, I'd like to explain the structure of today's meeting. We will begin with a brief welcome from High Bar Research Alliance Director Lauren Whitehead. Next, Emily and Jennifer will speak about broadening faculty reward systems to support societally impactful research for approximately 25 minutes. We'll then have about 25 minutes for Q&A, followed by an opportunity for Emily and Jennifer to offer any final takeaways. Now let's get started. First, I would like to introduce Lauren Whitehead from the University of British Columbia and Director of the High Bar Research Alliance, who would like to say a few words. Lauren.
Michael, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll be quite brief today. Just to tell you about the High Bar Research Alliance, it's a group of organizations and individuals who are encouraging a time-honored form of research project that we call High Bar, standing for highly integrative, basic, and responsive, as I'll now describe. These projects span the university-society divide through two key dualities. First, they are highly integrative. That's the high of High Bar, meaning that they have dual leadership of experts outside the university, who are also close to the problem being addressed, and experts inside the university, and who have directly relevant research know-how. The second duality is that they are basic and responsive. That's the bar of High Bar, meaning that they have the dual nature of being academic, that is creating new knowledge, and being responsive, addressing societal needs. One of the goals of the High Bar Research Alliance is to help universities enable, encourage, and reward those who wish to do High Bar research. And today's webinar is just a great example, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So, Michael, on that note, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Lauren. And so now I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Emily Ozer and Dr. Jennifer Rennick. Dr. Ozer is a psychologist and professor of community health sciences at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, and is also the faculty liaison to UC Berkeley's Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost on Public Scholarship and Engagement. Emily's research focuses on promoting the healthy development and empowerment of adolescents, bridging participatory research approaches and preventative science in school-based interventions. Dr. Rennick is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling, Educational Psychology, and Research at the University of Memphis. Her community engaged research focuses on the intersection of community, developmental, educational psychology, and specifically on how to improve school climate and connection for historically underserved adolescents. And with that, Emily and Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And Jennifer, thank you for sharing the screen. So here we are. Next slide, please. So I just want to start with the fact that this audience is probably aware that this issue has been getting a lot of attention. The question of how can universities be doing more responsive research, more societally impactful research. So we have a link here to a recent Chronicle of Higher Education article that highlights this issue for academia more broadly. And we're aware, and we'll be using some different terminology today. The language of the SCAN and the TEFN network is around societally impactful research, but really acknowledging that many of us come to this with different kinds of language that all have to do with being impactful while also doing research that contributes to our literatures and to knowledge generation more broadly. And again, this is a slide deck from the PTI network from Rich Carter, who I know presented to this group a previous month, and just to sort of show the broad connections and overlap in terms of some of where we're coming from this across very different disciplines. So this is the framing that we've been using at our university, and sort of where I'm coming from in terms of this. I'm, as Michael mentioned, I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and which is part of the broader University of California system. And especially being from a public university, public purpose is very much core to our mission and identity. And we see all the ways that our research can contribute to the massive societal challenges that are facing our state and the world. But we and others have identified a lot of the ways in which the institutional supports and the incentive structures have not been aligned, despite the fact that our mission is there. But so that's what this work is really grounded in. I just wanted to show, when I mentioned the University of California system, especially for those of you outside of the United States, just wanted to give a little context for the 10 universities that are part of our system. And as Michael mentioned, I come to this work as a psychologist, and very much having done my own partnered scholarship over the years. But as we'll get into later, this opportunity to engage with this broader scan has been a great learning opportunity. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jennifer. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So to give a little bit of context, the scan that we'll be talking about was commissioned by the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, or TEFN, which is a group of a variety of funders who are focused on creating the systemic and long-term changes necessary to transform how evidence is generated, mobilized, and used. And within that, there's a couple different priority areas in terms of including a focus on, catalyzing research practice policy partnerships. And so while TEFN commissioned the scan, the project team consisted of myself, Emily, as well as Dr. Bruce Gentleson, who is a distinguished professor of public policy at Duke, and Dr. Bami Maharamli, who at the time of completing the scan was working in the Center for Community Engagement at UCLA. As we mentioned, the scan is available online if you'd like to read it in its entirety. There's some things due to time we'll only be able to touch on a little bit high level, but the link will be shared if you'd like to download and read it as a whole. And so in terms of what the scan was and what we were hoping to accomplish, the goal was to provide an overview and comparison of promising attempts to reform and strengthen faculty advancement incentives to reward societally impactful research. So this wasn't meant to be a systemic review, but really highlight some exciting emerging areas. The way that we gathered information for the scan was primarily through interviews with key individuals who are engaged in institutional change at a wide variety of universities. We wanted to make sure we had public and private representation, as well as R1 and R2s, and a couple different targeted areas as well, like historically Black colleges and universities and land-grant institutions. We also did some document review and also some interviews with selected high-level staff of different professional organizations to get, a broader sense of the entire ecosystem for this work. As far as really high-level overarching findings we found through the scan, the first was that there is significant work in this area around, how are we recognizing societally impactful scholarship, as well as a variety of different approaches and kinds of initiatives that were happening across these diverse types of academic institutions. We also saw that there was still this consistent undervaluation of societally impactful scholarship within various university practices, but within that there was also a range of opportunities for different kinds of actors to support the recognition of this kind of work. In particular, some of the kinds of innovations that we saw universities adopting included things like formal policy revisions and guidelines when it came to promotion and tenure, creating, review structures and supports to help sort of implement these policy guidelines on the ground, capacity building for individual faculty, creating centralized, supported, and prioritized initiatives, as well as technical support and identity development for universities as a whole. I'll hand it back to Emily for these next couple of slides.
Thanks. So I'm going to dig in a little bit, but still staying high level, and also hope to orient you to the scan itself. So as we expected, there's a lot of variation across institutions. And accordingly, there are a lot of diverse points of intervention depending on the mission, the governance structures, the size, the resources, culture, et cetera, including this issue of rankings, which I think we can maybe touch on more in the Q&A if of interest. But just to give a few examples of some of the innovations we saw in the domain of promotion and tenure policy and case development, University of Minnesota Twin Cities, for example, has a campus case review team. May not be a fit for all institutions, pros and cons potentially, but a really important capacity building, kind of another structure or another mechanism that they included there. UNC Greensboro provides case workshops, seed grants, a campus advisory committee in this community engaged research space. And then an example, Duke Graduate Student Academy really focused on graduate students as the next generation of researchers and providing skills, capacity building around partnering in different ways. We also saw examples of internal funding, particularly from institutions with large philanthropic possibilities, such as Stanford, where there's been a multi-component investment, particularly around social science and innovation. And then for us in the University of California, Michael and I and colleagues at UCLA and elsewhere have organized ourselves to provide a cross-campus knowledge sharing and community of practice and support. And also, because we're an institution with very strong faculty governance, there have been some ways that we've been able to work on our promotion and tenure policies and guidelines in ways that might be distinctive from what some other university systems might be able to do. So other innovations in terms of capacity building, workshop series, such as at University of Minnesota, Portland State, doing work around collecting professional dossiers of faculty. It's really important. I think we've seen at our campus to have models of how you do this and how you do these case processes well. And then other kinds of internal mechanisms that support the work of doing societally impactful scholarship, such as internal grants to help cover teaching time, recognizing that doing authentic, engaged and co-constructed scholarship takes relationship building, partnership nurturance, et cetera. And so there's some good examples from UNC Greensboro, University of Maine, Portland State, Washington State, and again, University of Minnesota. So another overarching theme is that I think this issue of sort of where does change come from and where are the change stories? I think it's very much what we would call a yes and on the fact that having the bottom-up faculty and investigator support is critical, but also obviously having support, quote unquote, at the top from provosts and chancellors, et cetera. And that really varied. I mean, looking across the scan, we saw that some of that momentum and motivation came from sort of different parts of these complex ecologies that are universities, but definitely a yes and I think, particularly, I want to highlight that this scan, because it was supported by this large group of funders that we'll hear, hopefully more about, and Benjamin Olnick Brown from Pew Charitable Trust is on the line, and I think, possibly others. We were really thinking with our recommendations about what is the role of funders in particular, both public and private. So one of the recommendations had to do with the potential role of both funders and professional associations in convening provosts and chancellor level leaders, as well as faculty level champions. So preparing the ground for both internal and external investment. Also enhancing the awareness of the fact that there is a lot of interest among funders in seeing universities strengthen this space. And so that's an important message for people on campus to hear as well. Another key theme for us was really being intentional about doing funding in ways that supports the cooperation and the movement building. Those of you who are on this call I think are part of that, but there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration, and we would hate to see funding that actually created divides in this movement that's been very collaborative. The importance of capacity building and funding for change maker champions, in addition to people doing their research, and the need for larger scale investments and donor support strategies besides initial innovation, because there's some really important funding structures, like we've been funded by the Institutional Challenge Grant, by William T. Grant and Doris Duke Foundations and others. But a lot of these funding mechanisms are fairly small, so they're catalyst grants, but they're not necessarily sort of thinking about how you go to the next step. So another theme that came up is, as we think about doing this work across campuses and within our own campuses, sort of where do you stake the tent in terms of what's the focus? As we mentioned, there's a lot of different terminology, a lot of different disciplines, and there's commonalities, but there are also important differences. And so that came up as a theme about how to be inclusive, how to avoid tripping up in identities and turf issues. And so, how to be intentional about your language, how to think about what the internal coalitions and allies are, and noting that how you kind of think about the Venn diagram about who's in the tent for this work and for some of these institutional changes depends on what domain you're talking about. If you're talking about faculty evaluation and the crediting of public impact, versus you're also talking about the pain points of doing partnered scholarship, some of those, sort of who's in and who your constituencies are can vary a bit. And then as you all are aware of, thinking about some of the broad alignments in terms of other kinds of allies and incentives in the research ecosphere. It clearly doesn't make sense for us. We know that faculty evaluation, as well as our public impact, is something that happens in a broader ecosphere. So we can't really just be making change institution by institution. PTI is a great example of some really important overlaps. External organizations like the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, AAU, et cetera. There's some really important other actors in this space. And I think noting here that there's some overlap, of course, with thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion for some who are involved in community partnered scholarship, but also noting that there are some potential challenges, especially depending on what kind of political context one is in, particularly in the US. So I think as we said, context is important, thinking about how those contextual factors and features of universities influence efforts. There's a lot that we don't know here. We did an initial scan, and there's been some other important research that's been done. But I think, we know that institutional values can be a motivator, but there's a lot more inquiry that I think we need to do in terms of understanding, it's not going to be one size fits all. Another topic that we covered in the scan relates to metrics for evaluation, because I think that's one of the big challenges is you sort of don't go by the traditional metrics of academic impact solely. How do we measure impact? And so that's something that our colleague Bruce Gentleson has done a lot of work on at Duke. And so you'll see a section on that, and acknowledging that some of those traditional metrics are also flawed, and really advocating for not trying to shift to some other sort of simplistic quantitative metric, but really pushing for more holistic review. Another theme in terms of our framing was really thinking about external investments and also internal investments on the level of the faculty member in terms of actually supporting the scholarship, but then also thinking about the institutional change makers and how you support those of us who are trying to make changes on universities, not just in terms of funding, but also in terms of capacity building and networking, focusing on the infrastructure and the institution itself, and then this broader possibility of funding networks that can really lift all boats and connect and promote that kind of knowledge exchange and best practices exchange. And we have a section talking about what some of the next steps are for research and evaluation, because there's a lot we don't know about. You can make changes, but what's the actual impact of that? And how do you make sustainable changes in university systems? So some of these have to do with, how do we know what are most effective change processes, addressing some of the scope and sampling limitations of our current scan, considering who's aligned for leadership, or sort of what are sort of effective leadership for institutional change, how to best support cross-site knowledge that can strengthen impact and support careers, and how do we move forward with understanding of systematic evaluation of how we do this work well, and what its ultimate impact is in terms of broader societal impacts. So with that, I want to thank the funders of our own change efforts, and as well as have some links here. There was a great recent report, an action framework by the APLU. There's some other resources here. There's a link to the outstanding webpage and resources at UC Davis that Michael and team have developed, and links to some of our Berkeley and UC change efforts. So with that, I want to turn it back over to you. And unless, Jennifer, was there anything you wanted to add before I turn it over to Michael?
No, I don't think so.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Emily and Jennifer. That was wonderful. So while we wait for the Q&A box to get populated, I wanted just to maybe kick things off with a question. I mean, first, the recommendations are both affirming and really inspiring, and really kind of points us in the right direction of what really needs to happen. And it must have been a pretty heavy lift for you and your colleagues to really that broad of a scan. So congratulations on that. Maybe can you share what motivated each of you for taking on this project, and ultimately, what do you hope comes of it?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I think for me, I both conduct community engaged research, and I'm also interested in how we can better support individuals to do community engaged research. And I think there's been, at this point, a few decades of work really focused on individual faculty and how can we sort of develop the skill set. But that's obviously just one piece of this puzzle. And we have to also think about institutions as a whole and how we can set up sort of the entire research ecosystem to be more accommodating. And then on some level, somewhat selfishly, as a junior faculty member who does community engaged scholarship, I'm also, have a personal interest in thinking about how things like promotion and tenure policies can be more accommodating and inclusive of engaged scholarship, since it is such a, priority area, I think, for a lot of individual faculty, trying to make sure those systems of evaluation and recognition are cognizant of that as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think for me, it was just a really important opportunity to learn more about the landscape of what's going on more broadly, because I had, through the Institutional Challenge Grant Program, I've been aware of what's been happening with other grantees, because we get brought together and we learn from each other. But through the TEFN group, I've become much more aware of what's happening in climate science and this whole innovation and entrepreneurship space. And so it's been really fascinating to learn about sort of some of the connections and points of commonality and differences, and also just the broader set of actors. I mean, just being aware of HiBAR for one was a new thing, and just there's a lot. I'm very humble about the fact that there's been a lot of work and people working for many years to lay the groundwork. And so it was really eye-opening for me to be able to have that kind of broader perspective. So, yeah.
Great. Well, maybe let's stay on the topic of networks and field building. This first question speaks to the value of networks. And so the question is, what specific benefits do you see from the collaboration of multiple universities on promotion and tenure efforts? For example, are organizations like the University of California with our multiple campuses better positioned to change things? Are there other campuses working together, even if they're not under a single system like the UC?
So I can start with that. I think that I'm aware that tenure and promotion processes as well as merit promotion processes operate differently in different universities often, and also in different country contexts. So, what I'm saying is going to be US based, and also based in my experience of University of California. But a key part of the portfolio are the evaluations from other universities, from what are considered peer universities. And so it makes no sense to do anything that would just be focused on our own university, because such a core piece of the evaluation is coming from our peers. And so even just from that very simple slice, we see how this operates in an ecosystem rather than in terms of sort of individual universities. But if you think about the ways that the ecosystem also includes who you're funded by, where you publish, everything that has to do with establishing what is considered impactful, high quality scholarship is determined in a peer context, in a broader ecosystem. So I think we really have to be working across networks to do that. And I know that in our scan, and Jennifer can also speak to this, I know that we heard from some other universities that were in public systems, such as the University of Minnesota. But I don't think there was an example that we found that was similar to what we've yet. And I may not be aware of it, that was what we've been doing in University of California in terms of our kind of grassroots 10 campus work. So I don't know if I addressed, but Jennifer, what else? What did I miss? And what do you want to bring to that?
No, I would, agree and second everything Emily said. And yeah, there wasn't another example we came across. Something we did see though in some universities who were working a little bit more in isolation was the interest of networks, both for, trying to make the case at their own institution. We know that there's a lot of, peer influence when it comes to universities. So one being able to capitalize on that if this isn't already happening on their campus. And then additionally, to avoid reinventing the wheel, the fact that, University of Minnesota Twin Cities has a lot of these kinds of structures in place with example documents and meeting agendas and whatnot, for a university that's newer to come to this, to be able to draw upon some of those existing resources, especially given that, as was noted in the scan, not everyone's getting funding as an institutional change maker to do this work. So they have to fit it in where they can.
Right. I guess a related question that came up, did you come across any examples where these initiatives were engaging boards of universities beyond, say, faculty, councils, or university management?
That's a great question. I also want to acknowledge Benjamin Olnick-Brown, who has joined us from Pew Charitable Trusts and been a core part of our process. Jennifer, I'm not, I think that very much what we heard across the board was that it was critical for this to be part of the mission and the identity of the institution. And so I think that there was definitely work with the leadership and possibly with the boards to sort of say, to sort of push and say, well, this is what our mission is. And so how are we really aligning with that? But Benjamin, I don't know if there's other examples that you've seen.
Yeah, I don't think there were any at that level. I will say in the scan, and this is outlined if you read the entirety of the document, where the change was sort of located on campus, whether it was more top down, more bottom up, or middle out, varied. I don't think we talked about it much in the slide, but Arizona State had a president who really championed this. So that is an example if you wanted to read further about more sort of having high level campus leadership being some of the champions of this work.
Great. This next question is perhaps a little bit more practical, thinking about within institutions. So what have you found regarding the field level institutional changes needed for things such as letter writers for external evaluations, et cetera, and the methods to make those systematic changes toward more holistic evaluation, as you suggest?
So in the, we will be sharing the slide deck as an email afterwards. And in that last slide, there's a link to a website that we've developed at Berkeley that tries to deal with some of those practical tools, just, for our institution, because what we realized is that, there need to be model letters there available that talk about what our guidelines are, because clearly if when we go out, when it needs to be explicitly stated what our guidelines, because we, just a shortcut to say that we had an important guidelines change at UC Berkeley in 2021 that outlined the crediting of non-peer-reviewed forms of scholarship, such as white papers and testimony and other things, as part of our that should be in the research category and not the service category, as it typically had been if it was counted at all. And so anyway, so we've had to develop some of those tools, and I think that that's also been I don't know, I mean, I think that's been certainly part of the capacity building in other places. But Jennifer, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, more of what we saw on the letter side was either creating some kind of internal institutional committees that could provide supplemental letters that were explicitly focused on community engaged scholarship and included scholars on campus who did that kind of work. Additionally, having some, collaborative offices on campus that could provide some of those letters. And then similar to what Emily shared, a couple different universities like Duke and the University of Southern California trying to revise some of their guidelines in terms of where are things counted and how are we creating more holistic dossiers. I don't think at this point in time anything came up from the university side about revising instructions for external letter writers, but something we did see and we didn't touch much on in this presentation, but you could read about in the scan, was there is some work coming out of professional organizations like the American Sociological Association in terms of shaping how the discipline as a whole thinks about some of these things, which is a potential other way of addressing the external letter writer issue in this area.
And just one clarification, thank you, Jennifer, is that in our University of California system, even though we have the same very broad academic personnel manual, each campus has its own sort of more specific implementation of that. And so we have experienced, I think, through our connection and also through other UC, like such as Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz also was awarded the institutional challenge grant and has had some changes to their guidelines. So we have seen ways in which we've been able to build on what each other's doing, but it's not the case that there's sort of one change in one campus will mean that there's a change at another campus in terms of those specific guidelines.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it also sort of points to a larger, part of the report that really context does matter. The institutional types really do matter in terms of these interventions. And to your point, at the UC Davis, we recommended the formation of an ad hoc group of senior scholars to help with the review of merit promotion cases. And our academic senate said, no, we don't want additional overlays. We will handle it through our existing processes. But it does vary from campus to campus, regardless of the system. Maybe we could bring Benjamin into this conversation at this point. Maybe can you talk about, Benjamin, the role of funding agencies that they can play in facilitating the type of processes that both Jennifer and Emily identify?
Sure, happy to. And thanks for bringing me in, and thanks for the presentation, Emily and Jennifer. It's always great to hear you talk about this work and continue learning from you. I'll just provide a little bit of background on where this came from our side at Pew and from the Funder Network, and then a little bit about how we're thinking about what funders are doing and can do going forward. So for those who don't know, Pew is a public charity whose mission is to improve public policy, inform the public, and invigorate civic life. And through the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, we're working with a group of funders who recognize and believe that maximizing the public impact of their research investments is an important precondition to achieving any of those goals on issues of pressing societal concern. And that often includes, for members of TEFN, investments in engaged research, investments in evidence use infrastructure, and investments in research that is closely tied to those most proximate to a problem, whether they be government decision makers or community members or both. In turn, we recognized that, I think from the experience of grant makers across the TEFN network, that research cultures, research incentives are themselves important preconditions for enabling the type of research that many of the funders in the group are interested in investing in. And so a small group of funders, including the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Doris Duke Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the William T. Grant Foundation, and UK Research and Innovation, commissioned the scan that Emily and Jennifer have been talking about, really to understand where the field is, and also to understand, start to understand how funders can make a greater impact. Just like high level, a few of the takeaways that I think have been noted in our group since the completion and publication. We've been struck by just how much ongoing activity there is in this space, both at individual universities and across the ecosystem, including through organizations like HiBAR. And so I think this project has offered a recognition that the funder's role is really to accelerate the progress that's been happening and that's been led by champions at their universities and across the ecosystem, rather than necessarily to launch a lot of new initiatives, and that there are levers for change at a number of different entry points across universities and across these networks. I think another takeaway has been to recognize how promotion and tenure fits into the broader scope of university infrastructure. I know that was a real emphasis point, and so as we look forward in the work we're doing at Pew and with other colleagues in TEFN, I think maybe P&T is a sufficient but not necessary, but not a necessary but not sufficient component of institutional change. Maybe there are other entry points around the professional homes, around capacity building that Emily and Jennifer talked about, that are also of interest, and that it's very context dependent on the type of university. And then another takeaway from the report has just been the importance of evaluation of these institutional change efforts. And I think many of us hypothesize that these lead to changes in who in fact is getting promoted, what type of research is getting recognized, and that in turn those kind of institutional changes filter down to other outcomes of impact, whether they be in the community or within the university, but that there's a real need for deeper understanding of the way in which those impacts happen through institutional change. That's a long intro to answer your question, Michael, which is about kind of the role that funding agencies can play. I think a lot of this work started because of investments that individual funders in our group have already made and are continuing to make in the work of institutional change. So Emily's mentioned the Institutional Challenge Grant, which is supported by I think 4 philanthropic foundations to support teams to not only build a research practice partnership, but also to do some institutional change work on the campus and some capacity building work in the community organization to enable more of those research practice partnerships. So that's an exciting initiative that we saw one funder join for a new cycle that will be announced this coming year. Other initiatives, though, do look similar to that and happen in different spaces. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation supports a program called Transforming Academia for Equity that works with teams at schools of public health to give some planning time to identify what are the institutional changes they can make to really transform their schools for equity, and also do some cohort-based work with other grantees to advance that work across the field. I think the National Science Foundation is soon to announce all of the grantees of its advancing or accelerating research translation work, which are significant grants that partner multiple universities to build capacity for translational research. The Wellcome Trust has supported a similar effort across more than 20 universities in the UK called an Institutional Fund for Research Culture, which supports with £1 million to each university 2 years of institutional change work dedicated to some issue in research culture that is pressing in their individual university context. So what these initiatives have in common is, I think, the recognition of that context and supporting the work of institutional change itself, which goes beyond, I think, what the traditional funder's role is, which has been to support engaged research, support societally impactful research, and demonstrate that it's a priority to the funding organization, which would presumably in turn have an impact in the university. So we are seeing interest in the funding community in supporting this type of research growing. The Transforming Evidence Funders Network has grown to more than 70 funding organizations around the world. And we're continually trying to learn with each other about how our grant practices can enable this kind of research when it is most impactful. And then in the near term, just on some of the recommendations that came out of this report, I think it was very clear that our network can support the coalescing and acceleration of a lot of these exciting cross-campus national and international initiatives. So we've been working with the National Academies of Science here in the US to set up a workshop, a high-level workshop that's meant to, in the spring, dates TBA, but sometime in the spring of 2024 to bring together a number of the real thought leaders alongside decision makers across the research ecosystem to look at the learnings that have been happening and look forward to next steps. We've begun convening university chancellors and presidents with an eye towards longer term group that can lay out a framework for leadership level action in this space. And we're exploring how we can continue to support cross-learning and collaboration of these many university-based efforts and organization-based efforts through communities of practice and other mechanisms that might help those who are real champions of this kind of institutional change do their work more effectively and in partnership and learning with others. So thanks for the opportunity to share, Mike.
Great. It's great to see Pew taking leadership on this really important topic. I would also, I think Emily or Jennifer mentioned some of the work that APLU has been doing. I would point to a recently released report that really just reinforces the recommendations coming out of the SCAN report, which I believe it's titled Modernizing Public Impact Research. You can Google it. I think that's another good resource for those in the audience to take a look at. But what's really exciting to me is that it seems like we're at a tipping point. There's just so many different activities, so many different levels. So really, it's a matter of stay tuned, folks, and really just to find ways to share these resources. I'm going to shift a little bit now, maybe going back to the beginning of the presentation where you showed that sort of the cover article from the Chronicle of Education that came out a couple months ago around this sort of insular nature of academia and how that is juxtaposed to a growing public perception in terms of devaluing higher education. So these next set of questions get to this tension, if you will, between thinking about institutional change and disciplinary change, and do they have to work sort of in concert? So question is, to the extent that the peer review system is not controlled exclusively by individual institutions and is highly dependent on discipline-based perspectives on merit, how much progress can be made at the institutional or interinstitutional level without addressing how disciplines value engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question, which is why there was a slice of trying to engage some disciplinary organizations in our SCAN, but it was really, I think, the start to it. I remember when we had our initial conference and we asked for a list of sort of a potential pool of disciplinary organizations. I think we got a list of about 100. And so I think maybe I think that's a really important role for funders and for some of these larger backbone organizations like the APLU or, other broader organizations, because I think it's, obviously we can work within our own disciplines, but I think the landscape is it's quite massive. So I mean, I'd be curious what others think about that. I do think that I do think when you see changes coming from, you know, for example, I think the changes that our National Science Foundation made to at least have all grants speak to the impact of research. I think even, you know, relatively small changes and signals from these key funders that shape the funding possibilities for so many disciplines. I do think that's a really important role of the funders, because I mean we have to fund our research. So I think that's an important place where incentives do get affected. But I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think definitely as we're working on the scan and are thinking about our work going forward, something we've really wrestled with is the complexity of all the sort of players in this arena and what is each sort of one's role and sphere of influence. And so to the earlier part of the question, I think something we saw in talking to some universities that really focused internally to start is sort of any progress is helpful in terms of what's going to get us all the way over the finish line and most efficient. I do think this coordination of funders and disciplinary associations and even things like journal editors and internal institutional capacity, you know, we'd love to see that all happening in tandem. But in the interim, having some internal mechanisms, whether that's things like awards or internal grants, which provide some of the resources and the prestige necessary, whether it's, you know, building up some of your own internal structures for evaluating this work, and was able to help make a move in the right direction. But I would agree with the person asking the question that, you know, there's so many different sort of points in which there could be some challenges in this work. And so having more, you know, cohesion across different actors in this area is definitely something, you know, I think from the scan, we would be very interested in seeing continue to develop.
If I could just add on to that, because I think there was also a question about the language and the fuzziness of the language that came in kind of earlier. And I think it's such an interesting balance, because on the one hand, we want to have this sort of umbrella and coherence, but it's clearly not one size fits all. And I find that, you know, on our own campus, in my own school of public health, there are many faculty who are doing what we would consider high bar research, who would not identify with a community engaged frame. We struggle with even what to call it within our own university, because, you know, we try to be as descriptive as possible rather than using terminology that is only going to make sense in certain disciplines. But we had this event a few weeks back, sponsored by and organized by our vice chancellor for research, with our group, and it was incredible who came out and who saw themselves. I mean, we had people from I mean, a lot of data science people. We had linguistics people working on the preservation of you know, threatened languages. We had you know, dance. I mean, it's just, I think the more inclusive the kind of language we can use, I think people do see themselves. But also, you can have guidelines change at the university level, but those conversations and the letters that come in each department, that's critical, right? And so, you know, you can't dictate this from the top, but I think trying to create the enabling conditions and trying to, I mean, I think we're very fortunate at the University of California, because I think we do have an evaluation system that is quite holistic and, you know, is focused on sort of a broader portfolio, not on sort of one specific kind of grant or one, you know, specific number of publications. So I think we're fortunate that we have that to work with. But I think it's that yes and that I think we want to sort of think about the changes and the supports that can lift all boats, while understanding that those are going to need to be tailored by people understanding what the language is and what the values and identity are of both the institutions and of the disciplines.
Great. It was part of another question, but I think it's also just to highlight this. There's a question about the funding opportunities that are more focused on disciplinary reform. So I'm thinking of the Modern Language Association's guidelines for public scholarship, for example. So it seems like there are opportunities or space to think a little bit more clearly about these sort of disciplinary reforms that are in conjunction with more of the institution reforms. This next question looks at some of the, I guess, collaboration versus competition issue. So the question is that you mentioned the importance of setting up funding opportunities to support collaborative win-win efforts, presumably to avoid inadvertently setting up a competitive structure. Can you just talk about this a bit more, and where do you see the risks and what might be a good approach to ensure collaboration that does benefit all?
Well, it'll be great to hear Benjamin's perspective as a funder about what's possible on that. I mean, as you know, I kind of raise that every opportunity because I think we've just seen such, I think we've seen such, generosity of spirit and collaboration and sharing of practices. And I think we need to be very intentional about how we create those kinds of funding opportunities or shape them. I mean, I think there are, I wonder about, when you think about the individual faculty level, if there are ways of creating funding mechanisms that can be really broadly shared. And that can be like signaling it to sort of lift up and make visible those impacts. I do think there are ways. I mean, I've seen some great examples in the past where multi-site funding, coming out of the NIH, other kinds of health funding where you're funding the community partners and a range of institutions. So I'm sure there are models out there that many on the call that you all have a sense of. I mean, I'd be curious, Benjamin, as you think about it, what are some of the constraints or parameters that you all are thinking about along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and there are certainly others who could speak to this much better than I can. But it's certainly top of mind, particularly in our network of funders who are really invested in collaborative research approaches. If you're invested in the idea of collaboration as a means to achieving the desired social end, both in knowledge creation and policy impact and practice impact, that does beg the question of how to also enable collaboration among grantees and among those who might not become grantees to advance their projects. We've seen some mechanisms of funders setting up cohort-based programs for, not necessarily just in the institutional change space, but for engaged research investments, where they then create a community of practice among grantees, which is also open to projects that applied but were not funded, but cleared a certain threshold, so that there's still an opportunity for those projects to benefit from the collaboration with others working on similar issues in similar contexts. One of the really exciting innovations we've seen from some members of the network is moving to threshold-based funding mechanisms more generally, experimenting with if you have a pool of funding applicants, identifying which applications clear a certain threshold, and then among those deciding on who gets funded by lottery, as a mechanism to perhaps reduce some of that competition, but also as a potential mechanism for equity as well. So it's certainly a conversation that we're hearing, and important to think about, because it does challenge, I think, a lot of preconceived notions around the way that these calls are approached.
Thanks, Benjamin. That perspective really enriches this conversation. So we have a couple of minutes left. So maybe Jennifer and Emily, in the time that we have remaining, would you like to offer some final takeaways for our webinar audience?
Thanks. Well, as I said, I think this was really just an orientation to the report, which is really a start. We hope that it's conversation generating. It's certainly not the answer. And I think the intent of it for the network was really to, like you said, to sort of get a sense of the landscape of where we're at. And I think it's been, so I'm really hopeful. I'm really optimistic that there's momentum from across a range of different funders, a range of different kinds of university contexts. And I think there's so much that we learn from also looking at what's happening in models outside of the US. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to engage with this broader network and look forward to next steps. And also to say that, as I said earlier, we will be sharing, we can share our slide deck and there are links there, and please feel free to reach out and connect. Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Emily said, and trying to sort of, see this as a first step in continuing this work, and hopefully, building some new collaborations around that. So if anyone is interested in talking about this work further, we're hoping to continue, writing about what we learned along with folks who participated in the scan as well. And I would just say that, the scan really showed that there's so many different forms of innovation that are occurring in this space, and with so many different types of actors within and outside of academia. So there seems like there's a lot of really exciting potential there.
Well, thank you so much, Emily and Jennifer, as well as Benjamin. And thanks to everyone who has attended today's webinar. So please stay tuned for announcements of future events in the series. Thanks. Have a good day.